Okay, so today we're going to be talking about general rules and first species. We're going to deal only with 16th century counterpoint for now, and I'm going to teach you how to create your first species counterpoint. It's somewhat helpful if you already understand what a major and a minor scale is, and it's even more helpful if you understand the concept of a mode. But if you don't at this point, you actually don't need to really understand the various modes and scales and how they relate to each other to write a successful first species counterpoint. And the reason for that is that with counterpoint, we're dealing with the horizontal aspect of things, and with harmony, we're dealing with the actual chords that are used in a composition. So you don't really need to know anything about major and minor scales, you just have to be able to notate basic music. But it's important to distinguish between a scale and a mode. So a scale will use a pattern of intervals that does not change between each scale. The starting pitch changes, but the actual pattern of intervals doesn't change. So if I play a major scale, here's starting on C, this is a whole step to the D, from D to E is another whole step, from E to F is a half step, from F to G is a whole step, G to A is a whole step, A to B is a whole step, and B to C is a half step. And all major scales will have this same interval relationship. Play a D major scale. From D to E, there's a whole step. From E to the F sharp, there's a whole step. From F sharp to G, there's a half step. And you have a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. Modes are different. They're based off the initial set of pitches. So you could have a mode of C major. So if I was in C major, I would play the pattern of half steps and whole steps that made it sound like C major. If I wanted to play a mode of C major, so let's say I wanted to start in the second scale degree, so I start on D, all I would do is I'd use the same pitches from the C major scale, but I'd play it on D. So here's what D sounds like if we play this as a mode. It doesn't quite sound like a major or a minor scale. Compare that to the major scale that starts on D. Now here's the mode that starts on D. So it just has a different texture to it and a different sound. So when we write 16th century counterpoint, they weren't really using major and minor modes at the time. They were using the actual church modes. So you could start on a C, or you could start on a D, or an E, or an F. And each one of these modes, depending on the note that you start on, actually has a specific name. So notice how these scales here, they maintain the original interval pattern, while the modes are based on the original notes. So here's your C major scale again. Here's your D major scale. Here's your E major scale. They all sound the same, even though they're starting on different pitches, and that's because they use the same interval relationships. Modes will sound different. So here's your C mode. Sounds like a major scale because it is. Sounds a little flatter. It sounds less characteristic of what we'd expect from either C major, or in this case D major or D minor. Here's your mode that starts on E. And if you look at this, you'll notice that the mode that starts on C, D, and E, they all use a different sequence of half steps and whole steps. So when you start out with counterpoint, you will write through all the 6 modes that were used in the 16th century, so you can get practice with each one. And it's also good anytime you do a counterpoint exercise to try and mentally play it back, as well as play it on the piano so that you can actually hear what you're writing. In the 16th century and the 18th century, we had 2 different styles of counterpoint. So we will be learning 16th century today. And in the 16th and 18th centuries, I've always mentioned, we use the church modes and not major and minor scales. When we got into the 20th and 21st century, composers started to attempt to create their own versions of counterpoint that used a more modern concept. So in the 16th and 18th century, we relied primarily on these harmonic sounds, like a third, a fifth, primary goals of each downbeat in every measure. We wanted to have these nice consonant sounds that sounded more stable than your dissonant seconds. Your fourths were considered a dissonance, and even your sevenths could be used in a very particular way, but they were used much more sparingly in the 16th and 18th century. When we get into the 20th and the 21st century, all of a sudden composers wanted to work with more dissonance and sort of liberate the dissonance, and so what they would do is they'd try and create contrapuntal examples that emphasize the dissonance rather than the consonants, which we may eventually get into. Okay, so your counterpoint modes. These are all 7 of the modes, but the 7th mode, Locrian, was actually never used in the 16th century, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here's your Ionian. Here's Dorian, and you should practice singing these as well. Here's your Phrygian. Here's Lydian. Here's Mixolydian. Here's Aeolian. And then this one is Locrian. And Locrian just sounds a little bit weird. If you have very attentive ears, you'll notice that this first scale degree, the B, and the F, which is a 5th scale degree, that's a tritone. And so because of this, they actually never used Locrian because it presented too many compositional problems. So we have certain tones in music that are considered functional. The first scale degree in the 16th century was called the final. Now we'd call it the tonic. But whatever you call it, that first scale degree, it determines think of it as a tonal center for the piece. The 5th scale degree is also functional because this is in very close relation to the fundamental and the overtone series, if you've learned about that, and it creates resonance that has this pole that brings us back to the initial note of the piece. So because the 1st and the 5th scale degree are a B and an F, that creates a tritone, so it creates a problem because you can't have that strong perfect 5th pole. So what they did is, since they couldn't change the B and they couldn't change the F, they couldn't make the B a B flat, they couldn't make the F an F sharp, what they did is they just said, well, we're not going to use Locrian at all. So it presented too many problems. If you look at all the other scales, Ionian, C, and G, that's a perfect 5th. You can use that. D and A, perfect 5th. Phrygian actually is a little bit weird because the dominant is actually the 6th scale degree. But these two scale degrees are actually consonant with each other, and so that works. Lydian, F and C, don't have to change either of those because that's a perfect 5th. Mixolydian is G and D, that's a perfect 5th. And Aeolian is A and E, also a perfect 5th. So there's something else that's interesting. Typically, in order to create the sound of the mode, you want to use the pitches listed here on your screen. But with a few of the modes, Dorian and Lydian, you can actually turn your B into a B flat. And that was something known as musica ficta, which you could get into in your history courses, but this B flat was allowed. And if you think about that, if you change the B to a B flat in Dorian, you get a natural minor scale. You change a B to B flat in Lydian, you get a major scale. So already in the 16th century, even though they were using all these modes, they would do certain things that would gravitate us towards the major and minor scales that came later in history. Mixolydian is another case. The F could be turned into an F sharp, and so that would effectively make this major. So at that point, you have Ionian in major, Dorian would be in minor, Phrygian, you still wouldn't want to change anything here because the B has to stay B natural because of the 1st and the 5th. You can't change the scale degrees really. Lydian, though, would become major. Mixolydian would become major, and Aeolian would become natural minor. So in reality, they're still using major and minor scales, but they would alternate between the mode and the major and minor qualities. Etymology. etymology. So the term counterpoint is derived from the Latin punctus contrapunctum. This is a reference to the original method of notation that they used. So composers would take a pointed pen and they'd sort of flick the line above or below the original melody to create the counterpoint. So it was sort of making point upon point, because there was already points within the actual score. The counterpoint is one of two parts in a 16th century counterpoint composition. The counterpoint is the solution the student actually creates, the one that you actually create. And a complete counterpoint composition would consist of two parts. The counterpoint, that's the solution the student creates, and then the Cantus Firmus, which was given to the student by the teacher. And the Cantus Firmus was usually based on a religious text. It could not be changed, and often it was created and designed to present certain problems that the student would have to solve. So the etymology of the Cantus Firmus, it translates to fixed voice. It was the part of the composition you could not change, and it serves as a basic structure for the counterpoint. The teacher usually creates it, and again, it's to address compositional issues and teach the student how to write appropriately for two parts. So you also need to understand the difference between consonance and dissonance. In 16th century counterpoint, we have a clear delineation between consonant and dissonant intervals. Intervals over the range of a tenth are seldom going to be used between adjacent voices, so we don't discuss those. If you think about it, if you have a third, that creates a real nice harmonic sound. If you have a tenth, it's still pretty nice harmonically, and it gives us a nice range that we can work with. But if we start to go higher, to a 12th, a 13th, if we start getting further and further removed, then the counterpoint loses some of that harmonic friction that holds it together. It starts to sound weaker. So we like to keep our counterpoints close together, usually within the range of a tenth. An octave is even better, but it will create more harmony and more resonance if you do that. So your consonant intervals are the unison, the third. You can also have a fifth, a sixth, and an octave. So your perfect unison, fifths, and octaves, major, minor, thirds, sixths, and tenths were all considered consonant intervals that could be used. And for the most part, they can be used freely, but you have to treat perfect consonances and imperfect consonances differently. So a perfect consonance is the 1, 5, or 8. So that's going to be your perfect unison, perfect fifth, and perfect octave. While we now consider the perfect fourth to be a perfect consonance, it was not treated that way in the 16th century. You could use a perfect fourth in the melody. So for example, if I start on C and I want to leap up to an F, that'd be a perfect fourth. You could do that, but you had to treat that leap specially, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you could not have between the lower voice, the Cantus Firmus, if that's the lower voice, and the upper voice, which in that case would be the counterpoint, you can't have a perfect fourth. They viewed it as too dissonant. So your imperfect consonances, these are the ones that you can use very freely, and those are going to be your thirds, your sixths, and your tenths. Dissonant intervals are everything else. If it's not a unison, third, fifth, sixth, or octave, it's a dissonant interval, or some compound of those intervals. So what do I mean by compound? A compound third would be a tenth, a compound fourth would be 11th, a compound fifth would actually be a 12th. So you can use the compounds of the consonant intervals, but you really don't want to use the 12th because that would go beyond that range of a tenth. And we'll talk more about that. So you've got to avoid dissonances, especially in first species. We don't use any dissonance at all. It's not allowed because it's note against note, which means that everything's going to occur on the downbeat, so we can only have consonant sounds. So why is the fourth a dissonance? The fourth is considered a dissonance in some instances and a consonance in others. The discrepancy is based on the voicing and how it relates to the overtone series. So this actually gets into three-part counterpoint, when you can identify the fourth as a dissonance versus a consonance, because we could actually use it in other species, but not in two-part counterpoint, which is what I'm teaching you right now. So if you look at this first measure, the fourth is considered a dissonance because it doesn't fit the harmonic series. So if you have a three-part or three-voice counterpoint that has a fourth between the bass and the middle voice, you wouldn't be able to use this. If, however, you have a fourth between the upper voices, that's okay because that fits the overtone series. Remember, the overtone series, you start with your fundamental pitch, let's say C. The next one's an octave. So it goes up an octave to the next C. Then you have a fifth, and then you have a fourth. So essentially what you have listed in this second measure is what would be considered consonant because it fits the harmonic series. This one does not, so we don't use it. So there are basically 4 preliminary steps for writing a counterpoint, and these are basic guidelines. The first thing you do is you label the cantus firmus in your examples. This way we know where the cantus firmus is. So the cantus firmus is the top line, so I labeled it as the top line. Then you identify the counterpoint. You can use CPT as your abbreviation, but as long as you label the cantus firmus, we know that everything else is a counterpoint to it. The next thing you want to do is number the measures. This is sort of a tradition where you number the measures to help the instructor easily talk about errors in your composition. And it's a good way to kind of go through and double check each measure because you can actually create a graph if you wanted to and say, okay, measure 1 looks good, measure 2, 3, 4, and you can just check everything off. The final thing you want to do is you want to identify the generic interval number. So notice I didn't write P8, P6, M3, M3. I didn't do any of that. I just wrote the diatonic interval number. That's all we need. The only time you want to write a clarifier is if you have a dissonance, and you shouldn't have that at all in first species, but let's say you had a D and an A flat. That would be a diminished fifth, so you'd want to label it as D5. If you had a D and a G sharp, which is actually the same thing, you'd label it as an A4 because it's an augmented fourth. So you only want to label dissonances. You don't need to label whether they're major, minor, or perfect. So here are your various types of motion. In this first example, we have an E, and then we have a C in the upper voice. And then it moves into a D in the upper voice and a G in the lower voice. So that's an example of similar motion. It simply means when 2 voices are moving in the same direction, but using different diatonic intervals. So you have a 6 in the first measure, and then it goes into effectively a compound third in the next measure. Actually, that's a fifth. And that's actually an example of something you have to avoid, because this G to the D, that parallel fifth quality, this is called direct motion into a fifth, which we have to avoid, and we can actually talk about that a little bit later. So this is an example of similar motion. And we have to be careful with similar motion because this fifth, if we're not careful, it can really draw attention to it, and it just sounds like one of the lines is dropping out. So it can go either way. You can go up or you can go down. Contrary motion, both the voices are moving in different directions, as you see here. They're moving in contrary motion to each other. Parallel motion is a type of similar motion. They move in the same direction, but they use the same diatonic intervals. So here we have an A and a C, and here we have a B and a D. So it's 2/3 moving in the same direction. Same interval, same direction. And then here you have an A and an F, so that's a 6. And here you have a G and an E, that is also a 6. So they're moving in the same direction as well, so that's parallel. Parallel is important because you can't have parallel fifths or octaves. Oblique motion, this is where one voice stays the same and the other moves. We like to use this as little as possible in first species. And general rule of thumb is only use it once or not at all. The preferred type of motion is going to be contrary motion, followed by similar. Parallel is okay, and oblique is also okay. So it's kind of a hierarchy where parallel and oblique, it's arguable that they're both about equally as ineffective for creating that independence. but at least with oblique motion, one voice holds the other moves, so you can clearly hear the difference between the two voices. So we've got 4 rules of motion. In 4-part harmony, direct motion into an octave can be fixed by moving by step in the soprano. In 2-part counterpoint, and really 3-part writing, you can't do that. You can't fix direct motion into an octave by simply moving by step in the soprano, so you have to avoid it in all counterpoint. So there are 4 rules of motion. From a perfect consonance, like a unison 5th or octave, to another unison 5th or octave, you have to move by contrary or oblique motion. So what that means is you really shouldn't move from a 5th into a 5th or an octave into an octave, but you can move from a unison into a 5th. It's something to avoid, but it's permissible as long as you move by contrary or oblique motion. So from a perfect consonance to an imperfect consonance, so a unison 5th or octave moving into a 3rd or a 6th, any motion is possible, you can't make a mistake. From an imperfect consonance to a perfect consonance, you can use contrary or oblique motion unless you are skipping or leaping by contrary motion into an octave. You always want to avoid skipping into an octave by contrary motion. It just draws too much attention to that octave and it should be avoided. So from an imperfect consonance to an imperfect consonance, no error can be made. You can move from 3rds and 6s, from a 3rd into a 6th, or even a 3rd to a 3rd. You can use any type of motion you want. It's complicated, but luckily there is a rule that simplifies all of this. So you can simplify the 4 rules. Essentially, there's one rule that you really have to follow. Beethoven was kind enough to reduce the rules to just 2, and Martini, a theorist, reduced them further to just 1 rule. And that rule is, do not move in direct motion, which is similar or parallel motion, into a perfect consonance. So here, this is what happens. If you move from an octave into an octave, it sounds so transparent, it just sounds like there's one line. You really lose the texture. The next example is perfect fifths, moving in parallel fifths. It sounds really archaic, and there's no quality to the sound. You don't get the sound of the 3rd, which identifies the tonality in a lot of ways. So that's one reason, but the thing about counterpoint is we really don't care about harmony. A lot of counterpoint instructors will make students write the chord progressions, or at least the chords that are implied, underneath the solution, and that's ambiguous at best because often there's going to be 2 or 3 different chords that you could potentially identify it as, and it also doesn't result in good harmonic progressions in most cases. So it teaches the wrong thing. The point of counterpoint is to concentrate on the horizontal voice leading aspects of the music. You don't want to worry about the harmonic implications at this point. So then once you get into 4-part harmony and you learn about chords and standard progressions, then you can go through and you can edit your counterpoints when it makes sense to. But you may not want to edit your counterpoint works because you may be very happy with the voice leading. That may be the effect that you want, and so you'll say no to harmony in that instance. In other instances, you don't like the way the counterpoint resulted in, you don't like the way your counterpoint sounds. So you can go through and you can use some harmony to go in and fix the points that sound bad to your ear. So the next one, hidden fifths and octaves. So here we have essentially a 10th, and here we have an octave. It's hidden because you don't see the parallel octaves. It only occurs after you arrive on the downbeat. So we also call these direct fifths and octaves, but this is where you move from similar motion into an octave or similar motion into a fifth. So this C and A moving into the E and B, that would be hidden fifths, and that would be hidden fifths. First one would be hidden octaves. So here, if I have my C and my A in the bass, it sounds like this. It just sounds like one of the lines drops out. In the next one, you have your A moving into the perfect fifth, so the 6 moving into the 5th. it just sounds very archaic and it doesn't give the sound we are looking for, so you have to avoid those two. Alright, so this is the Battuta. The Battuta is something you should avoid in 16th century counterpoint. So if I play the Battuta, it's basically when you move in stepwise motion, in contrary motion, into an octave from a tenth. So here we have a D in the bass, then we have an F up here, and it just comes down into the octave. It sounds like a cadence. So if you use that in the middle of a phrase, that would actually be problematic because it would sound like the counterpoint's coming to a close prematurely. What I usually allow my students to do, because Fuchs actually leaves it up to the student to decide, but I allow them to use a voice exchange. So if you have a voice exchange where the D exchanges with the D over here, and the F exchanges with the F in the bass, I permit that because that voice leading overrides the sound of the cadence. It sounds like it wants to keep going. Because you have that cadence sound there, but then we're allowed to keep going because that strong stepwise contrary voice leading motion. And you'll find in music theory over and over again that voice leading is important to understanding how a lot of harmony functions. So Fuchs, he's sort of the authority. This is his book, Study of Counterpoint, Gradus ad Parnassum. It's a great book if you want to study more on counterpoint. But he talks about the Battuta and he says that it occurs with stepwise contrary motion from a tenth into an octave. So he mentions to the student that it's up to the student because the issue was of little importance. It never actually happened in 16th century counterpoint. And as I said, the likely reason is because it gives the impression of a 10-8 cadence. It's okay to do it from a strong beat to a weak beat, and it only occurs in first species. So you really only have to worry about it in first species. That's why when we write these first species counterpoints, I ask students to write out the 10 instead of writing it as a third, so we can identify the Battuta more easily. I typically do allow the Battuta if it uses a voice exchange, but my reasoning for that is that when we get into harmony, we only teach counterpoint in relation to harmony so that we can understand the voice leading and some of the decisions that composers make are based on voice leading. So the voice exchange is such an important and desirable effect in music that I allow it in the compositions as long as they do use a voice exchange and don't leave it as a Battuta. Counterpoint relies very heavily on the concept of steps, skips, and leaps. So your definitions for these are as follows. Steps are any interval that is equal to or smaller than a major second. We don't use microtones, so you've got your minor seconds, although you wouldn't use them consecutively. We're avoiding chromaticism, it's got to be diatonicism, and major seconds. That's the beginning of your whole tone scale, and again, we wouldn't use that way in counterpoint, but major seconds are allowed. Skips are anything that is an interval of a third. So a major third, minor third, doesn't matter. Major third or a minor third. A leap is going to be anything that is a perfect fourth or larger. But not the seventh. The octaves, okay. So these are how we identify steps, skips, and leaps. And when I refer to a step, a skip, or a leap, I'm going to be very particular. So if I say skip, I mean a third. If I say leap, I mean a fourth or larger. Your melodic considerations. So the melody lines must be primarily stepwise. If you use a skip or a leap, the line generally changes direction immediately after the skip and proceeds stepwise. If you can't proceed stepwise, then you just have to use a smaller interval than the initial leap. So if I jump from C to F, I can then come down to E, that would be my preferred pitch because it's stepwise, or I can come down to D. I could not come down to the B below the C. I cannot come come down to the A below the C. We want to fill in those skip notes at least partially. So you can use ascending and descending leaps, but you cannot use them if it is a tritone, a major 6th, 7th, or 9th. So those are not allowed melodically in counterpoint. So, for example, I cannot have a leap of a tritone. I can't even have the leap of a major 6. I can have a minor 6 though if it fits diatonically. The minor 6 leaps are allowed in ascending motion only, so you cannot leap down a minor 6. So really, your leaps are limited to a 4th, a 5th, and an octave, and the minor 6 ascending. So that's a hard thing to remember, but it's not a bad idea to just make a note of that one because it's one of the easiest mistakes to make. If you get stuck in your counterpoint, you need to leap really far. Just remember that you can't leap down that minor 6. You can leap down a 4th or a 5th though. So the high and low points, melodies should have one high point. Counterpoint solutions below the Cantus Firmus should have only one low point if possible. But this is going to be less crucial, and I don't focus too much on it because you already have a high point in the counterpoint, the Cantus Firmus, not the counterpoint. So the high and low point should also be consonant with the final. In the 16th century, we call the first pitch the final. If you are more familiar with major and minor scales, we call the first scale degree the tonic. So the tonic, final, it's really the same term for two different things. And here's your range limit. You can go from F2 all the way up to A5. But you can't go above A5, and you should never start a counterpoint on A5. I did that once as a graduate student, and I got a big mark on my paper that says never do this. And you have to think about it in terms of the choir. Generally, counterpoint was written for choir, and so we want something that's easy to sing. You don't want to start out the sopranos on a high A, especially if they're not professionals or if they are part of a choir and they're not soloists. We want to make it easy to sing, and that's why we like to use stepwise motion. We like to resolve our leaps because singing a whole bunch of leaps in a row, that's kind of hard to do, and you quickly run out of room. So you want to avoid those leaps unless you resolve them in the opposite direction. Harmony voice leading guidelines. So your consonances, you've got the unison, third, perfect, fifth, sixth, and 10th. 10th is just a third. So 10th is generally the largest interval used and the largest distance allowed between the two parts. But again, with counterpoint, there's always those emergency exceptions. And if you need to go to a 12th, the 12th is the most you can use when it comes to the distance between the two voices, so the Cantus Firmus and the counterpoint. Your dissonances are everything that's not a consonance. With consonant intervals, you should have no more than 3 intervals of the same type in a row. So you don't want to have more than 3 thirds. That 4th one, you should try and find another interval. Because what happens is after about the 3rd one, it all starts to blend together and it sounds like a single line, single melodic line. So what we want to do is limit it to 3 of the same interval in a row and no more than 4, and only for an emergency or if you really like the sound of it. The Battuta, not allowed in any species of 2-part counterpoint, but again, it can only occur in first species. So your permitted motions. Your perfect consonances can be approached by contrary oblique motion only. Never approach an octave on a downbeat using a skip or leap. So that's important. We always want to step into those octaves. So one line at least has to be stepping into an octave. Imperfect consonances approached by similar, parallel, contrary, or oblique motion. You can use any of those motions. Just use oblique motion sparingly. Accented beats are going to be your downbeats. So avoid unison, fifths, and octaves on consecutive accented beats. So from downbeat to downbeat or from measure to measure, you want to avoid that. Faulty motion. No parallel and contrary unisons, fifths, and octaves in any species. So this is sort of your cheat sheet. This is a complete list of all your first species guidelines in one convenient slide. So no dissonance is allowed, and you need to avoid leaps with the tritone, major 6, and all 7ths. The minor 6 is okay ascending. When the cantus firmus is below the counterpoint, using unison, fifth, or octave to start the counterpoint. When the cantus firmus is above, only a unison or perfect fifth can be used. Don't start with a rest in first species. Other species, we will be allowed to do that. Repeated notes are okay, but don't use any unisons unless it's on the first or the last beat. And rule number 6, the third to last note cannot ascend by a third to the leading tone in the penultimate or second to last measure. So you've got to watch that ascending third to the leading tone. It puts an unnecessary emphasis on that leading tone and it sounds awkward. The cadence above and below the cantus firmus uses modal degrees, scale degrees 1, 7, and 1. So your cadence will typically, in the third to last measure, use scale degree 1. You can also move by step into scale degree 7, just avoid that ascending third. Just make sure that the 7 is a leading tone, which means you often have to raise it a half step. In Phrygian, though, we do not raise the 7th. It's not sharped. If you move from a fifth to an octave or vice versa, it's okay, but you must use contrary motion. And preferably one of the notes is moving, one of the voices is moving by step. And then just remember that forbidden motion, do not move in direct motion, which is similar or parallel motion, into a perfect consonance. So when you're writing the cantus firmus, that's going to be the line that is written out for you. In this case, it's right here. We can tell because it starts and ends on the same pitch. There is no leading tone in the second to last beat, and the last 3 notes typically in a cantus firmus will move down by step. So you always want to label that cantus firmus. Make sure the second to last note is the 7th scale degree, and in this case it is C sharp to D, and we raised it, so that's good. We would raise this in every mode except for Phrygian. And most of the notes in this counterpoint solution have followed the rules of first species, but there's actually an error. If we look at the cantus firmus, we have a single high point. Any leaps, like this D up to the G, have been resolved by step, which is preferred, and then most of it is stepwise motion. So if I play this for you, you're going to notice potentially something wrong with the top line. So that sounds like a nice cadence. It thins out at the end and then it just decays. But the problem with our counterpoint solution is there is not a high point. We have 2 C's and this D is actually the high point and it's repeated at the end. So that ruins some of the melodic shape. So you always want to make sure that you write in that high point. So the first step in writing your counterpoint is identifying the cantus firmus. In this case, it's in Dorian. Your second step, write in your cadence. So here, we're in Ionian. So that means we're in C. We want to use 6-8 for the upper voice, 3U if it's in the lower voice. So we've done that here. And you can also use a 10-8 if you wanted to. In this case, I don't have to make this a B sharp because it's already a half step. If I made it a B sharp, it'd become a C. So that's your first step. Write in that cadence. Next, write in the opening. If the cantus firmus is below the counterpoint, you can start with a fifth or an octave. It's your choice. If the cantus firmus is above, start with a unison or an octave. You cannot start with a fifth. If you start with a fifth, if I have a C, so I'm in Ionian, I start with the fifth below, all of a sudden it sounds like I'm in Lydian, which is the one that starts on F. So you want to avoid that. You need to make sure you really emphasize the tonality or the modality of the counterpoint solution. The next thing I typically do is I write in the high point. So here I went ahead and I put it about halfway to 3/4 of the way through the composition, and I put my F here in measure 5. I wanted to have an early high point. Here I made it an E, and this will be the highest point that I have in my counterpoint solution below. You should also try and have one low point, but again, that's going to be less important. But if you get that high point in, then you know where to go towards. And you may have to change this high point once you write out your counterpoint, you may find some issues with it. So the remaining part, fill in the remaining voices. Use primarily sixes. You see lots of sixes. Use threes. Avoid using octaves. Use them sparingly. And avoid using fifths. Use those sparingly as well. Make sure you approach them in the correct way if you use a fifth or an octave. So let's go ahead and play this first one. It's all the way up here. Sounds good. Sounds like we have a nice cadence. You may have noticed it sounded a little bit like the voices dropped out here, but then this strong voice leading helped to compensate for that.